Good evening. So thank you, Judge Rogers, for that wonderful introduction, and thanks also to Ken and the IHMC for the wonderful hospitality and the conversation with the mayor, learning a little bit about what's going on here in Pensacola. You know, when I lived down the road in Tallahassee, this is where we used to come for fun. That'll tell you about both towns, right? So I'm going to talk tonight about the great American incarceration experiment, some of its costs, and I hope I'm going to talk a little bit about what I think is, as the judge said, is on the horizon for us in America. I'm going to have some Florida examples of some of the work that I'm talking about. About half of this talk is based on my book, Imprisoning Communities, and about half of the talk is based on the book that's about ready to come out. And I hope that that when I'm done, I've stimulated a little thinking, probably stimulated some questions, maybe a little disagreement. You don't bring a person from New York down to Pensacola without trying to get at least one argument going, right? So, and I'm just delighted to be a part of this lecture series tonight. So, what has been the great prison experiment? In the United States, we've had a growth in the incarceration rates and a number of people locked up for nearly 40 years. Nowhere in the known history of the human race has this occurred anywhere except in the United States. I used to ask in audiences like this if anybody has been born prior to 1971. I won't ask in this audience because I'm telling you, we all have seen 1960. So, and what I would do is people would raise their hands and I said, you've never drawn a breath when the prison population in the United States wasn't growing. So for most people, even in their 30s and in their late 30s, the growing prison population is an entirely normal experience. Having more prisoners the year after the previous year is something that happened in the United States for 40 consecutive years. And so it's easy for us to think of that as a normal thing. It's normal for prison populations to grow, but it's actually historically abnormal. And the only other place where this happened was immediately following the Civil War in the South, in the southern states for about 20 years. And other than that, in the known history of the universe, this has been something that has occurred in the United States and only in the United States. So it's a truly American, truly experiment, a true social experiment with incarceration, with punishment. In 1972, there were 200,000 prisoners per 100,000. By 2012, there was an 8-fold increase in the number of prisoners and a 5-fold increase in the rate of incarceration. Every single year from 1972 through 2012. How did this happen? It happened from what Jim Austin and I have called the iron law of prison populations. That is, prison populations are produced by two numbers: how many people go there, new crimes, and how long they stay. There is a third dynamic, which Judge Rogers has been talking about, and we'll talk about more tomorrow, and that is how rapidly they return to prison, which is another way of saying how many people enter prison, right? So it's like a hotel. You want to fill up a hotel, have more guests come, or have them stay longer, and if you do both, you're going to get permission to build a new hotel. This is a graph of incarceration rates and crime rates in the United States. It's the single most important thing I will show you tonight. So you can't see these numbers. This is 1931. This is 2010. So this is an 80-year period in the United States history. The blue line is the crime rate. The red line is the incarceration rate. And what this shows you is that for most of this 80-year period, for about half of it, incarceration rates in the United States were stable. They fluctuated between 90 and 120 per 100,000 every year. In war times, they went down. Why? Why would they go down in wartime? You got other things to do with young men. And in depressions and in recessions, they went up. Why? And that's what you do with young men. But a famous criminologist right about here wrote an article arguing for what he called a homeostatic theory of punishment. That is, there's a society needs a certain number of prisoners in order to function as a society. It's a Durkheimian argument. And you sort of need that many. You don't need less. You don't need more. About here, he recanted that theory. But the reason why this graph is important is because of what it shows about the relationship between the crime rate and the incarceration rate. Now, this is a controversial idea because you'll hear people say, wow, you're going to lock up more people, you're going to get less crime. And if I ask you today, we're going to increase from 2013, and over the next 40 years, we're going to increase the number of prisoners by 8-fold and increase the rate of prisoners by 5-fold. What do you think? You'd say two things. We can't afford it. And I say, well, let's say we pay for it anyway. What do you think? Well, crime will go down to 0, you'd say, right? It'll go way down. Well, we've done this experiment. We're just finishing it. So what's interesting here is that the growth in the crime rate, the blue curve, most of it happens in this period of time, right? More than half of it happens during a stable period of incarceration. And during that time period, people argued, crime rate's increasing, we got to start locking up more prisoners because that's the only way we're going to fight crime. So we started locking up more prisoners. We had about an 8% annual increase in the number of people locked up between this period of time and this period of time right here. That was bigger than the growth in the economy. Actually, there was no number that matches an 8% increase in incarceration rates during that time period. Not the economy, not war, not peace, not the number of people of prison-bound age, 20s to 40s going into the population, not the number of young men aging out. No other statistic matches it. So we use the iron law of prison populations to produce that growth by increasing the number of people who, I'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute, by increasing the number of people who are going to prison and increasing their length of stay. What happened to crime rates? Crime rates continued to grow. And and during this time period, they went up and went down and went up and went down again. During the highest rate, there were two curves in crime rates, going up and going down and going up and going down. Finally, the incarceration rate growth started to level out. And in fact, in the last couple of years, there's been actual drops in the number of people incarcerated, mostly led by the states of New York and California. I know people in Florida hate those two coasts for different reasons. Because I was a Floridian and I used to engage in that practice. But what you see here is that at a time that we're not increasing the number of people locked up, crime rates are dropping dramatically. So what's the relationship between incarceration and crime? Not much. Not much. I know it doesn't seem to make any sense, and I'm going to spend a part of my time explaining why that's true. But we've done the experiment. All I want to tell you is we've done the experiment. The results are in. We now know that if you want to do something about the crime rate, focusing on imprisonment is probably a bad idea. So that period of the graph that I just showed you describes 3 periods of prison expansion. In the 1970s, most of the growth of incarceration was due to the growth in the amount of crime. Right? So the number of people go in, how long they stay. The likelihood of being arrested for a crime stayed the same regardless of the number of crime rates. The likelihood of being apprehended for a crime was identical. So you had more crimes, you had more people apprehended, you had more people going to prison. Pretty straightforward. In the 1980s and 1990s, there was a growth in the number of people entering prison, mostly due to sentencing reform, partly due to increased length of stay. That is, what happened was in the 1980s and 1990s, we changed our sentencing policies. Crime rates went up and down during that time period, but stayed homeostatically around the same level. But because we increased the number of people going to prison, we increased the number of people and their length of stay. We increased the number of people in prison. In the mid-1990s to 2009, when we were beginning to see a drop in crime, we saw growing imprisonment rates, mostly because we made people stay there longer. So, for example, the state of Florida, for 10 years in a row, had a growing prison population, but a dropping number of people going to prison each year. How'd you do that? You kept locking up people into their later ages, and the older and older people. And so the fastest growing age group in the U.S. prison population and in the Florida prison population is people in their 40s, 50s, and 60s. By the way, they're not the most criminally fearsome group of people out there. So the crime rate in 2010 is about what it was in 1972. In other words, we 5-fold increased the rate, we 8-fold increased the numbers, we got the same crime rate at the end. Same crime rate at the end. This is a prison intake. Remember I said the prison population is produced by how many people go to prison, how long they stay. What you see here is that the blue line is admissions, and the red line is prison population. And what you can see is that the admissions is dropping dramatically in the last 3 years of this graph, but prison populations is not dropping as much. Why? Because we're keeping people there longer. This is what happened to length of stay. In 1990, the median, this is a median, this is the middle year, it's not the mathematical average, it's as many people are released earlier than this month as are released after this month. So for violent people convicted of violent crimes, the median length of stay was 44 months. For property crimes, it was 21 months. And for drug crimes, it was 19 months. By 2009, almost 20 years later, violent crime had gone up to 60 months, property crime up to 27 months, drug crime up to 26 months. So what you can see is we changed what we did to people in this time period. That was a 16-month increase in violent crime, a 6-month increase in property crime, and a 7-month increase in drug crime. Changes in sentence and length of stay and parole supervision length. So if you say, I want to have people convicted of crimes be vulnerable to the state, you start with the sentencing date and you go through the end of the parole eligibility, right? They stay in prison, they're released on parole. When do they finish serving their entire sentences? In sentence length in 1993, the median was 48 months, and the average, mean mathematical average, was 66 months for in 1993. That's because a lot of people serve very long sentences. A few people serve very long sentences, driving the average up. In 2009, the median was length of stay, sentence length was 36 months. The mean was 60 months. So you can see that we actually were imposing lower sentences in 2009 than we were in 1993, but the time served increased. So the amount of time they spent in prison increased from 21 months to 29 months. We are partly were keeping people in prison because we were refusing to let them out even though they were eligible to be released. The state of Florida did away with parole release. I was a member of the Sentencing Guidelines Commission in its last year of existence when the legislature had already eliminated it, and I never attended a meeting, but it's on my resume. Parole time went up from 19 months to 26 months. So what you see here is you've got almost a year and a half additional eligibility, additional punishment, even though sentences are dropping. So it's funny because what you do is the judges are actually imposing less punishment, but the system is holding people longer. Elapsed time, a 15-month change in the total amount of state time owed on the average. This has, of course, produced a change in the mix of the prison population. So in 1980, 60% of the people incarcerated, this is a day snapshot of a prison system, 60% of the people incarcerated, 6 out of 10 are violent, 3 out of 10 are property, 6 out of 100 are drug, and less than 10% drug and public order in 1980. We changed a bunch of sentencing laws, particularly focusing on drug-related crime. By 1993, the number of violent people behind bars, the proportion of the people behind bars for a violent crime is dropping, property crime is dropping, and now we have almost 3 in 10 of the people behind bars are there either for a drug or public order crime. By 2005, with recidivism statutes beginning to kick in, we get we're back up on violent crime, more dropping on property crime, and again about 3 in 10 for So what we've done is to increase the prison population by holding people sentenced for drug and property and public order crime longer. Now, if you'd have said, this is what we're going to do as an experiment, there would have been an argument. Someone would have said, you know, maybe that's not the right plan, but we did it. This is what we actually did. So incarceration in the United States is not an equal opportunity employer. The people in incarceration rate in the United States is about 1%. 1% of people are locked up, but not your risk of being locked up is not 1 in 100. This group here, I can tell you, I look around, some of you got near 0 risk of being locked up. Another way of saying that is, it is true for me that all of my crimes are behind me. And I believe that's true for most of the people in this audience. But incarceration does concentrate in certain ways. So I'm sorry for how small some of these letters are, but and some of you, I'll be sort of repeating what's up here. So just to use your ear balls instead of your eyeballs. So incarceration concentrates on gender and age. Over 90% of the prisoners are men. On the average, 700,000 men go to prison each year between age 29 and they exit at age 32. So they go in at the age of 29, they exit 32 or 33. These are crucial years for young men, right? These are years when young men should be growing in the labor market. They should be adding to their skills. Their resumes should be growing. And what these young men are doing is taking an extended time out. Over 1 million children have a parent behind bars. So the current estimates are growing, actually, that now believe it's almost 2 million children. That's an old statistic. Incarceration concentrates by race. Black men are 7 times more likely to go to prison than white men. For women, the ratio is 8 to 1. 12% of black men aged 24 to between the ages of 20 and 40 are currently behind bars as I speak, 12%. At current rates, 1/3 of black children born today will go to prison during their lifetimes. Now, if I said we're going to do an experiment, and here's what the experiment's going to be. We're going to take 1/3 of all the black children born, male children born, and we're going to give them an experience of prison. What do you think, gang? You'd say, I'm not going to sign up for that experiment. But we did actually do that experiment. Blacks are 10 times more likely to be in prison than to be in a labor union or to be on welfare. 10 times more likely to be in prison. Now, we're spending a lot of money. Prison's not cheap, but that's what we're spending it on. We're willing to spend a lot of money on the basis of race, but that's what we're willing to spend it on. It also concentrates in terms of location. So place. So there are neighborhoods in Cleveland and Baltimore where about 1 in 5 of the adult males are behind bars in any given day. 1 in 5 of adult males behind bars on that day. In Brooklyn black neighborhoods, 12.4% of the men go to prison in a year. In the white neighborhoods, it's 2.7%. In Chicago, over half of the prisoners who are released go to 7 Chicago neighborhoods. Over half of the prisoners released to Chicago go to 7 neighborhoods. In Tallahassee, which I'll talk about more, in 2 neighborhoods, this is where I got started on this work with my wife, Dina Rose, by the way. We were doing a project in Tallahassee, and I'll talk about it when I show this map in a minute. And actually, I'll come to Tallahassee in a second. Let me do Delray Beach first. So this is familiar stuff. Crimes concentrate. So this is crimes in Delray Beach. Anybody here know Delray Beach? All right, so you can draw this map. The brown section is the Atlantic section of Delray Beach, where the blue, where all these crimes are here. This is Atlantic, I think it's Avenue, right? This is the downtown. This is some of the wealthiest land in America, wealthiest people in America, and some of the poorest people in America. And the crimes concentrate along that area. What you see, there's a little hot spot up in the north. There's a couple of little gray spots around, but it's really, the real concentration is the Atlantic section. And this is a juvenile arrest map, and you'll see that it does the exact same thing. It concentrates there are most of the sections of Delray Beach in this year, no juveniles were arrested, none. But in the Atlantic section, you can see that a large number of juveniles have been arrested. And in the top blocks, the minimum, where this color is, the minimum number is 60. Individual blocks, 60 kids arrested in that year. This is jail and prison admissions in Brooklyn. I'll come back to Brooklyn in a minute. What you see is, again, it concentrates in locations. There are sections. This is Brighton Beach. My wife's grandfather lived there. My wife's father was raised there. But what you see is that the concentrations of incarceration rates are up in some parts of Brooklyn. In other parts of Brooklyn, no one's going to prison. I'll talk more about those areas in a minute. This is annual jail and prison admissions. So how do we get all these prison admissions? I'm gonna not do a criminology theory lecture here. I'll just talk through this very quickly. So criminologists have speculated that incarceration and crime is related because social disorganization in these neighborhoods and produces the inability to engage in informal social control, that is to use the neighborhoods to get kids to obey the law. That's one theory. Social networks is another theory that People who have strong social networks are able to avoid criminal lifestyles, whereas if there are weak social networks with limited social capital, that means they don't have an education, they don't have the ability to sell any skills, they're more likely to get involved in crime. And then there's social learning, people who are learn how to get engaged in crime, learn it from the peers that they spend time with. Every one of these mechanisms is made more difficult by incarceration. When you have a neighborhood where 1/5 of the men are locked up on any given day, you have much less parenting, you have much less informal social control, you have a great deal more social disorganization. The social networks are focused on maintaining men in prison. They don't form, and the kids spend all their time with other kids who are also engaging in criminal activity. So, and then there's a final theory called defiance theory. This is becoming more interesting now. If I say to you, if you do X, Y, Z, I'm going to kick your butt. You know, I might be bigger than you. I'm actually not, but I might be bigger than you, and then you might say, I'm not going to do this until he turns his back. But when I turn my back, you know, I'm vulnerable to you. Defiance theory says that when people believe the system is unfairly dealing with them, they will not only not obey the rules of the system, they will try to get the system back. They think they can play the system. So all of these theoretical mechanisms suggest that incarceration can produce more crime, not just reduce crime. And if these are cumulative rather than interactive, then in these neighborhoods where all these problems are being concentrated, crime rates are going to go up. You can't read this list, and when we walked through this slide, somebody pointed out to me, this is just a list of about 50 studies that have been done of the collateral consequences of incarceration, each one of them showing a negative effect of incarceration rates concentrated among people of color in poor neighborhoods. Among children, I'll just run through a few of these. Having a parent go to prison increases your chances of getting involved in the criminal justice system by 25%. It increases the chances of having a mental health diagnosis by 25%, controlling for everything else. Families. If you are a black male who's been released from prison for a year, you're as likely to be living with a woman with children as if you are a black male who's never gone to prison. You're 1/3 as likely to be married to that woman. If you don't like marriage, prison's your thing. Parenting. When one parent goes to prison, the other parent has a reduction in ability to discipline the child effectively. Communities. We know the biggest new scientific evidence about controlling crime in communities is called informal social control. It's called, the fancy name is collective efficacy. The neighborhood takes care of its own problems. Places where lots of men are in prison have reduced capacity of neighborhoods to take care of their own problems. Makes sense, right? Health. This is a study done in South Carolina. If you look at neighborhood level rates of incarceration, they predict rates of HIV, gonorrhea, syphilis, and other sexually transmitted diseases because you've destabilized intimate relationships by having men cycle through the prison and making women vulnerable to men, and women have less ability to manage men. And there's an increase in teenage births. And if I were to say, give me a delinquency prediction, teenage births would be just about the best variable you could pick. Economics. Going to prison reduces your lifetime earnings by 40%. You got a neighborhood in which every man has been to prison. You got a neighborhood where all the men together are producing 40% less economic activity. In that neighborhood, you can't support stores, you can't support businesses, kids can't get money after school to do the kinds of things they want to do. They can't, right? You've just taken away the economic capacity of that neighborhood to be a neighborhood. Why do poor neighborhoods stay poor? Partly because we put men in prison and keep them poor. And then finally, politics. Studies in Portland, Oregon show that young men who live in neighborhoods where there are high rates of incarceration, but they themselves have never been imprisoned, are more likely to say the system is unfair than young men who live in other neighborhoods who have not experienced incarceration. We create you know the don't snitch, we create the don't snitch. But through incarceration helps create the don't snitch ethic. This is the Tallahassee map. Go Knowles. That was supposed to be funny. This is a one-year crime and incarceration and prison release map. The dots are prison releases. The shaded areas are crime rates. So you can see the biggest crime rate is the downtown area and so on. And we began studying incarceration. What we learned was that the statistical relationship between incarceration and crime is complicated because there is what's called a linear relationship between the number of people who are released from prison to a neighborhood and crime rate. The more people released from prison to a neighborhood, the higher the crime rate in that neighborhood. So you just add up more people, you add up more crime, makes sense. But the removal, and this is the curve for the removal. If you remove people from a neighborhood, and you would think the neighborhoods get safer. You got active criminals, you're going to remove them, neighborhoods get safer, right? And that's true for the first portion of the removals. But after a certain point, you start removing so many people that the neighborhood begins to be destabilized. You get less informal social control. You get less economic activity. You get less parental supervision. You get less healthy lives. And you get all those things so that the crime rate, at the higher levels of removal, the crime rate begins to increase. To the point that the neighborhoods that have the highest volume of people cycling through the prison system, in and out of the prison system, get a double whammy. They get all the crime that comes from people being returned from prison, and then all the crime that comes from people being removed and sent to prison. This is a Tallahassee map. This is Florida State is right down here. My office was right here. This is Frenchtown. So that's a map of 1 year's releases in the Mission Hills, Lower Frenchtown section of Tallahassee. If you don't know, there's an African-American section. It's the original African-American section of Leon County. It's the only place where black men could blacks could buy property in Leon County after the Civil War, and it's been a black section since time immemorial. You can't count them, but there are 50 dots up there. So I'm going to ask you to look visually at this map. I'm going to do a little visual experiment. So this 50 dots is 1 year's releases into that section, 50 dots. But you don't get a release without removing somebody, right? So just visually, just stare at this, and just go with me for a minute. So double the number of dots in your mind. So that's 1 year's activity. Okay, so you've got the dots there, you've doubled it. Now take that and double it again. That's 2 years' activity. Then take that and double it again. So you've doubled it, and doubled it, and then doubled it. You got to have dots in your head all over that map, right? You're a high school freshman. That's what you experienced in that neighborhood during your high school years. That's the number of disruptions of people being removed and being returned. When you're removed, the neighborhood has to compensate, and when you return, the neighborhood has to compensate. And when you doubled those dots, and you want to know what our policy was when we did this map? It's not true anymore, but the parole office was down here. All those dots go down here and pee in a bottle once a month. We got this system, right? That's what we did. That's what we did for informal social control in Lord. When we did interviews, we discovered this idea. My wife and I we like a couple of white people from New York, right? So we're sitting in one of the stores right here on this this corner here. There's a restaurant, a cafe, and we would sit in there and we would interview people come in. Could we talk to you about incarceration? And they would go like, okay. And we interviewed over 100 people in this neighborhood, about 125 people in this neighborhood. And we asked each one of them the question, has somebody from your family been incarcerated in the prison system of the state of Florida in the last 5 years? 125 people. We asked random people, we went knocking on door to door, we sat in churches, we talked to people after church, we did a lot of things to get these interviews. I talked to neighborhood councilmen and all that stuff. 125 people, 100% answered that question yes, including a former mayor of the city of Tallahassee, a black woman, including the president of the Urban League, and including the reverend of the Baptist church, the largest Baptist church in that neighborhood. You are black and you live in that neighborhood, you have family members going to the prison system, you just do. And you know what? They told us they know that. When we would talk to them about this, they would say, you know what, if this were going on in a white neighborhood, no one would stand for it. This is sentencing ratios in Brooklyn again. The blue areas show ratios. The dark blue is 8 to 1, meaning that there's 8 adult males aged 20 to 40 for every one person going to prison in a single year in that neighborhood. These are not small neighborhoods. Tallahassee, Frenchtown's a small neighborhood. It's about 2,000 people. This is 250,000 people. And you know what the entire criminal justice apparatus in the city of New York is designed to do? Get that ratio to 7-to-1 if we possibly can. You know, we want more people going to prison. More people going to prison. And these are expenditures on prison and jail. So you can't see it. The brownest ones here, the top one, in a single year, you take the number of people going to prison, you multiply how long they're going to stay, you multiply times a year's cost of prison, you get a cost in that block of how many for incarceration policy. The brown ones are $1 million minimum. Every brown, there are 25 brown blocks up there, individual blocks, and every block is $1 million or more. The top block is 3.8 million. So let me just tell you what this actually is. It is taking money from people who live on Park Avenue and giving it to people who live in Attica to watch people who live in Brooklyn for 2 years and send them back worse. That's what that policy is. We're willing to spend a lot of money on Brooklyn. Terribly broken neighborhoods in Brooklyn that need resources, need things. We're spending tons of money. We're just not spending it on Brooklyn. We're just not spending it on Brooklyn. When you hear the phrase $1 million blocks, it's referring to that map. Today's debate. So there's a little bit of a debate on the impact of incarceration on crime, and there's a few tired people who still want to argue. The first data, by the way, in the 1970s was every person you lock up prevents 572 crimes. And if you take the increase in the number of people who were locked up between 1970 and today, and you multiply it times 572 crimes, you get more crimes than the total crime rate. So that number can't be right. And then a lot of other studies. And the early studies in the 80s and 90s showed huge effects of locking people up. The studies started to get more sophisticated. They started to look at larger data points, longer time periods. And then the more recent studies, have shown that there's not a zero relationship, but have shown that the number of people incarcerated has a very small relationship between on crime. And Bruce Western's work, Bruce Western, the Harvard sociologist, estimates that a 10% increase in the number of people locked up results in less than a 1% reduction in crime. And two of my colleagues at Rutgers now estimate that we've locked up so many people that we're now borrowing into the less prominent criminally active crew, and the marginal reductions in crime are near zero for new growth in incarceration rates. So this is the big incarceration experiment. We've done the big experiment. We've seen that the relationship is very small, and now the time is what do we want to do about that? There's also today's debate a lot of talk about the collateral consequences of incarceration. All the studies I referred to and summarized, there are now over 50 of them. All of them talk about how it is now true that you cannot ignore the fact that when you send people to prison, you get a lot of collateral consequences, not just for them, but for their family members, for their communities, and for the rest of the society. So we know that when people go to prison, there's a lot of negative consequences. We also now know that there's lots of negative consequences if people don't go to prison and their communities. And it's no longer possible to ignore those studies. And so what's happened is today you're beginning to see much more interest in the question, how do we reduce the mass incarceration? So if you want to answer that question, you have to remember what I told you before about the iron law. You have to do something about how many people go to prison and how long they stay. Everything else is noise. You know, I'm a big follower of the Innocence Project that has identified people on death row who are innocent of the crimes and gotten them released. If you've ever met somebody who was convicted wrongfully of a crime and talked to them, it'll change your life. It'll move you. I've been on stage with people doing conferences. It moves you. But if every innocent person were released from prison today, we'd still have mass incarceration. By the way, if every guilty person had to go to prison, thanks for laughing. So what does that mean? So there's some distractions on mass incarceration policy. There's some emotional topics. For example, innocence, like I said. Innocence is a terrible problem of justice, but it's not a mass incarceration problem. I believe in the work they do. I'm a great fan of it, but it's not about mass incarceration, it's about justice. The death penalty. You can have whatever feeling you want about the death penalty and still have nothing to do with mass incarceration. All of the spectrum of opinions about death penalty have nothing to do with mass incarceration. There are programmatic topics. So for example, reentry. You're going to hear a lot tomorrow about reentry. And you're going to hear about programs that have made enormous inroads about making reentry more just, more supportive, and more fair. But if all of the reentry programs you're going to hear about were started tomorrow, you still would have a problem with mass incarceration. Because how do you get to reentry? You go to prison. By the way, I'm a huge fan of the work that you're going to see tomorrow. It is absolutely important that you understand this work. I sat in and watched some of the work the judge is doing. This is impressive stuff, and it deserves our support because it is just and because it is right and because it works. But if you want to do something about mass incarceration, you're going to have to look bigger. Alternatives to incarceration. I got my reputation as a person who developed alternatives to incarceration. I can tell you that there are very few alternatives to incarceration that are really alternatives to incarceration. And if all of the alternatives to incarceration worked the way they're supposed to work, you still would have a problem with mass incarceration because you have so many people going to prison who aren't eligible, and you have them staying so long. Finally, rehabilitation. As a matter of human rights and human justice and sensible policy, rehabilitation programs should be available to people in prison because people deserve to have a chance to change their lives. But now you know the mantra. They're in prison. They're already there. And if you leave them there for as long as they're going to stay, the rehabilitation programs will be the right thing to do, but they will not have much to do with mass incarceration. So I have 4 proposals for you. One is reduce the length of stay for sentenced prisoners to 1988 levels. Don't even go back that far. Most of our laws that changed length of stay dramatically were recidivism laws, and they happened since 1988. So if you go back to 1988's, what's a great song from 1988? I suppose that somebody here can sing a hit from Led Zeppelin or something. So go back to 1988. Divert all technical parole and I says parole and parole, it means parole and probation violators from prison and reduce their length of stay in prison when they go back. Roughly a third of all the people who enter prison in the United States enter prison without a new felony conviction. Don't let them go to prison. Do something else with them. And this is, by the way, one of the great advantages of the programs you're going to see tomorrow and the ones that I saw today. It does something about technical parole violators. Eliminate mandatory penalties for drug crime and divert all public order cases from prison. No public order people go to prison, and no more mandatory drug penalties. So I was in the state of Delaware when they passed the 3 will get you 3 law. 3 grams of any substance will get you 3 years minimum time served. And they had a big, news conference out in front of the State House, and all the cameras were there, and the Attorney General was there, and the Governor was there, and I was a consultant to them at the time on alternatives to incarceration. And they had this whole thing, and they talked about how if you're going to do drug crimes, you're going to stay away from Delaware because we got a 3 and 3, right? And they went from that news conference to the back room to where they had the conversation. Oh my God, what have we done? How are we going to do this? So eliminate all those mandatory penalties. And then reduce the length of stay for people placed on probation and parole. We have people serving very long time periods on probation and parole, and they're vulnerable to technical revocation for a very long time. The state of Nevada reduced its prison population by making one change. They cut time on probation and parole in half. They did nothing else, and they reduced their prison population because people were no longer eligible for probation and parole. Those are 4 proposals. What would that do? We have a lot of activity going on right now of people trying to reduce prison populations. And 1/3 of the states of the United States have either closed or proposed to close a prison. This is about a year old, this slide, so it's a larger number now. So these are the states, including Florida, which have either closed or proposed to close a prison. 2/3 of the states have enacted criminal justice reforms designed to reduce prison populations. Those are the states. So what you see here is the conversation today is not about get tough anymore. It's about get smart. The Republican Party has the smart on crime proposal. The most interesting, look up here, there's a lot of red states up there. The most interesting reforms in the United States are going on in red states, not blue states. You want to know one of the problems with these reforms? It's unions representing people who have really benefited from the growth of the prison system. Right? So right now, all of the innovative activity is going on, and it's going on in the states, and there's a ton of it. So what's my conclusion? So one way of looking at this is that the US prison growth between 1972 and 2010 was an unprecedented policy experiment in which we said we are going to privilege incarceration as a way of responding to crime no matter what. Crime goes up, crime goes down, at war, at peace, good economy, bad economy, we're going to use prison as the primary response to crime. The evidence now has come in. If there's anything we know, it is two things. One, that we have not had the kind of meaningful impact on crime we would have expected to have had. The drop in crime we've had is about the same that England has experienced and about the same that Canada has experienced without doing our experiment. So we have some control groups out there, English-speaking control groups, and you can just tell you that there's a worldwide drop in crime, and we're experiencing and getting some of the benefits of it. The impact on crime is, as I said, minimal. The collateral consequences are extraordinary. They are troubling, both morally and economically. And you don't see a lot of people standing up and saying, we want more of those collateral consequences. And why? Because they are simply stunning. And they are things that we don't want to have to live with. The fiscal implications are enormous. So some of my colleagues who are looking at the current debates about mass incarceration and saying the debates have changed, argue that when the economy comes back and we have a lot of money around again, the debates will change back again. I don't think so. First of all, we've got, and this room is the evidence, we've got a lot of people who are moving into ages where they need retirement, they need health care, and they need supported living, and those programs suffer at the hands of incarceration costs. Secondly, infrastructure in the United States is a disaster. Something like a third of the bridges need to be repaired. You can't get internet in so many places in the country. I had internet, I was in Uganda this summer, I had internet everywhere in the country. Uganda. And thirdly, the weight of the evidence doesn't support this doing it anymore. You used to have criminologists arguing, lock up a few more people, that'll help nobody's arguing that anymore. There's a handful of sort of out there people that they also don't believe in global warming. Today's policy environment is completely changed. 10 years ago, if I gave this talk, there would have not been a receptive audience. Today I give this talk, there's a lot of heads going like this. Now it's troubling. It's troubling because we've spent 4 decades with this policy. And it's hard for us to get our minds around the fact that we have to do something about it. But we are at the very beginning of an important change in American debate about crime policy. We are entering a time of prison population reduction. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you very much. Okay, can you hear me?
Sure.
Oh, good. I noticed your first slide showed about 40 plus years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Can you attribute any of this to the Great Society and the lack of individual responsibility?
Let me say something. I've the growth in crime rates in the United States was experiencing was very similar to a growth in crime rates that was going on in other parts of the world. So I do think that there's something about individual responsibility here, and I do think that there is something about infrastructure. But I think that I've not seen a good study that convinced me that the link was the way you just described it, although I think it's a reasonable hypothesis. Yeah, right here, I'm sorry.
You talked a lot about how incarceration is not solving the problem. Do you have any ideas about how to reduce crime?
Sure. So let me argue two different things, and then I'll put them together. One, that everything we know is that focusing on early childhood development matters more than anything. So keeping a kid in school, getting a kid to school early, keeping a kid, getting a kid early health care, you know, stuff that happens before kids turns 5, 6, 7, it really matters. It's pretty expensive because you're doing it for every kid, and not a lot of kids are going to be criminal, right? So how do you pay for it? Well, you say we're going to take money we now spend on prison, and we're going to instead spend it particularly in high incarceration neighborhoods on making sure kids get what they need. Now, that's called justice reinvestment. That phrase, what I just described to you is the phrase justice reinvestment. The federal government's got a handful of justice reinvestment projects going on. So let me just say something really radical. I'm not advocating, I'll come back to you in a second. I know you got your follow-up question. And Obama usually gives one, doesn't he, or something like that? So, bad joke. Going to prison does not change your chances of recidivizing. It doesn't go up, it doesn't go down, right? In fact, there's a slight benefit if you stay out of prison of a likelihood of committing a new crime. Length of stay has no relationship. You stay a year, you stay 5 years, same likelihood of recidivism, doesn't affect it. So here's the irony. In the state of Florida, you could let out 10,000 prisoners tomorrow. You get a big spike in crime for a period of time that was the average length of stay, and then it would go back to what it would have been if you'd done nothing, right? You're getting such a small benefit of that incarceration rate over such a small period of time. Yeah. He's got another follow-up question.
You talked about we should reduce incarceration. That seems to be pretty clear here. So if we do that, then you're talking about spending the money on the early childhood. Is there something else we can do? Because, you know, we only got 5 or 6 years of people. What else?
So we know this. We know that when people are staying free of substance use, their crime rates go down dramatically. That in periods of time when they're actively using, their individual crime rates go up. So anything we can do to reduce the length of active use and the periods of active use will directly contribute to public safety. And that is the biggest argument for programming in the system, because the people who are currently at risk of committing crimes, if you can keep them free of substance use, about half of them, their criminal activity is directly related to their substance use patterns. You can have a big impact there. So I think spending money on substance abuse programs will have an impact.
Time for 2 more questions.
Back here and then back in the back. I'm very sorry. I'm going to stick around and we'll answer some more questions.
Yes, on the crime concentration maps that you showed, I'm curious, is there any data that suggests that crime concentration is due in fact to the occurrence of crime, or is it because of the arrests made in those areas? Because it is the case that there are some groups that have higher use of drugs and they're not getting arrested.
This is one of my favorite points of one of my favorite people. David Kennedy is very fond of saying that we don't arrest people for use of drugs, we arrest people for being involved with drugs and living in a poor neighborhood. Self-report drug use patterns for teenagers, white people are about half again as likely to report using an illegal drug in the previous year as black people, teenagers. But black teenagers are 3 or 4 times more likely to be arrested for a drug than a white teenager. So there's if a police department needs to make a lot of arrests, it knows how to do it. I'm not accusing the police of doing that. I'm saying that is a known fact, right? So drug policy is a place where enormous inroads can be made on this problem if we can get sensible about it. There was one hand in the back.
Yeah, I think we've been talking a lot about statistics, and that's great, but numbers are numbers. That's not people. What I am concerned about really is the socioeconomic conditions that cause people to be causing crime, to be becoming criminals and winding up in the system. and the system gets to be more like a hotel, you know, where we got to have population in the hotel because you got to justify their existence. But why is it? Are we doing anything, in your opinion, to fix the socioeconomic situation that has been created that is causing this increase in crime?
That's a great question. I like that question a lot. You know, my office is in Newark, New Jersey. Congratulations. We should talk. We were plotting, we're looking at impact of incarceration rates on crime rates in 3 different cities, Boston, Newark, and Camden, New Jersey. And Newark, New Jersey doesn't have any wealthy neighborhoods. It just doesn't have any. You know, and so when you think about this, about 1/3 of the people who are in school as sophomores, of the young men who are in schools as sophomores in New Jersey, finish high school. 1/3. The unemployment rate for blacks between 18 and 30 in Newark, New Jersey is almost 40%. So, time bomb, my friends, right? And then add the fact that Newark is filled with guns and gangs, and you've got everything, all of the things you need to have a terrible violent crime problem. Now, here's the irony. It is extremely concentrated in a handful of places. Much of Newark is, all of the areas where I work are safe. Much of Newark is safe. Just there are places that are battle zones. And we've allowed those places to be like that. Now, I think 30 years from now, when people talk about this period when the incarceration rates changed, we will either have a conversation about taking on these issues, or we will talk about the enormous moral failure that occurred by refusing to take on these issues. There are many, we can disagree about how to grapple with them, fair enough. And I think we need a lot of experimentation on how to grapple with them, fair enough. We don't have 3 answers, fair enough. But walking away is to declare the city of Newark, those neighborhoods in the city of Newark, as completely lost. Every child born there, completely lost. Every family that can't move out, completely lost. Every school operating in those neighborhoods, completely lost. Can we morally allow ourselves to do that? And I think the answer is no.
On that note,